So thanks for joining me in this discussion about documentaries. I'm Georgina Cammalleri. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I work across both television and independent feature documentaries. And as many people have already said, you know, when you hear the term virtual production, you think big budgets, like Eric's work. But this talk is really about the little guy, me, and how VP can be a game changer on a smaller scale within the world of documentaries. So in the first half of this presentation, I'm going to walk you through how I use virtual production in my latest documentary, which followed a more traditional documentary format. And I'll be breaking down each setup and sharing what worked, what didn't work, and how we can improve it. And then in the second half, we'll shift gears, and I'll talk about the more imaginative ways we can use this technology in documentaries. And that's me with my Game Boy. So over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a sharp rise in retrospective documentaries, largely driven by the streaming boom. Because for streamers, documentaries based on stories in the past are lower risk. You know, when you think about it, the story has already happened. It's self-contained, so everything can be planned in advance. And usually they tend to follow a familiar format. I'm sure you've all seen. You know, you have your master interview that becomes the backbone of the narrative. And then you've got your archive footage, which grounds the story in reality, and either reconstructions or general views, which become the visual language of the film. What this means for virtual production is that you can integrate this in the pipeline quite early on, because the documentary is already planned out in advance in a sort of scripted way. Unfortunately, this is not what I did. And this is what I learned as a result. So back in 2023, I directed a feature doc, Right to Fight, about the pioneers of women's boxing in America who fought for their right to professionally box because it was illegal for women to box at the time. It was really rewarding to capture this story. It was kind of lost history. No one had really documented the story before, and so it was just fun to be able to capture the story in a really entertaining way and get to meet all these crazy characters, including a boxer called Killer Diane. Obviously, she didn't kill anyone. That was just a boxing name. And you know, just women, working class women that just love boxing. And like I just mentioned, you know, this documentary followed a traditional retrospective model. So we started off by filming all of the master interviews, which are these. So you've got Kat Davis, who's from Louisiana, Pat Pineda in California, Sue Fox in Oregon, and there were a few more. And usually around halfway through the edit, a line producer will budget for about 2 to 3 days of interview pickups. So these are moments where, like, you get in the edit, you're piecing together the narrative and you realize, oh my God, they didn't mention this really important part in the story, or she said it like a robot, we need to redo it. So you go out back into the field and you get these moments that you may have lost originally. So when we approached this moment in the schedule, the line producer told us, you can't go back to these original locations. Like, you just can't go back. I'm like, what do you mean? You know, I need these locations. You know, like, what are we going to have? She's like, it's just too expensive. And they're meeting in New York as part of a verite scene, the final scene. And we just need them all to be in New York. So you're going to have to find a way. So we couldn't go back. And that's when someone said the dreaded words. Right, and just a disclaimer, my colleague doesn't look like that. So when I heard the green screen word, I was having all these like nightmare visions of like Pat Pineda, who's got curly frizzy hair, just like covered in green snotty pixels and looking like a floating head. And I was like, it's just, you know, like the idea of it really just freaked me out. And I didn't want to kick the problem further down the road with, oh, we'll just fix it in post, like, don't worry about it. So luckily, I had attended a taster session with Final Pixel. And so I learned about LED volumes there and wondered if this could be an alternative. And by wondered, I was so happy that it was an alternative. And the production company were very open-minded. So we had to start working on trying to retrofit everything to make it work and to use LED volumes for these pickup interviews. So apologies for this horrible image. It's like the only, what this shows is us attempting to rebuild a plate using lots of imperfect sources. So this was the first step of our process, and the circles indicate areas that we still needed to work on. So we didn't get any clean plates, right? We're working backwards. We didn't think we were going to use virtual production, so we were working backwards, and we realized we never shot just the location without the person in it. So suddenly we were just going through all of the footage and just finding moments where the contributor would laugh and bend over like ha ha ha, and then that's a bit of location we can use, or bend down to get the bottle of water. That's another location, you know, bit of the location we can use, and slowly using like, I don't know, 5 or 6 different frames, we would piece together with the help of VFX artists to do something like this. Obviously, this is not the final thing, right? And slowly we got all of our locations as sort of one clean, seamless plate that we could use. And so once we had all of that, we sent it to the Final Pixel studio in New York for mock-ups before shooting it. And these were our findings. And just before I go into it, it's a mix, you know, it's a mix of things that worked and things that perhaps didn't work so well. And I'll start with one of the trickier ones. So that's the original interview, and this is the virtual production interview. So I'll walk through, and this is Pat Pineda, by the way, the first ever licensed professional boxer in California. So one of the main challenges of this setup was, obviously, she's got this bar here and this stool here, and she's leaning on it. And we just didn't have an art department to rebuild that. And we didn't have the prop, like that exact chair as well. So it was tricky. And even if we did have the time to do it, it would have been tricky because you can actually see like the bar goes all the way to the wall. So like you could see like where they meet, where the real and the virtual meet, and that would have been so hard to sell. So what we decided to do was come up with a simple solution. We're like, let's just change the lens, right? So we used a 50mm lens to punch into the image, and we made sure, as Eric was talking about earlier, that the screen reacted to how how the environment would react if you were looking at it through a 50mm lens. So a shallower depth of field, and that gave the impression that we had a third camera in the room. So another challenge that we had was, because all of these interviews are shot with a fixed camera, you can't create that kind of parallax effect with the movement. So that meant that you just didn't get the same sort of feeling of depth that you would had you been using the kind of parallax cues. And the plate itself was quite bright as well. And so what we found was that, because it's not just giving us background, it's giving us a light. So it was kind of catching onto like the back of her head. So we had to make some adjustments to make sure that you wouldn't see that. So yeah, those were the challenges, and like we darkened the wall a little bit, we changed the lens, and looking back, you know, it would have been great to have more of a dynamic plate to just give you that sense of, you know, like a living space. That said, I thought Cam B was quite good. Like, I thought it sold it much better. Like, you can see maybe she's a bit, like, the highlights are a bit too bright because we had to darken things and then up the light. So I was happy with this. And I'll show you a BTS video just so that you can see the setup. And just to stop there, like, even though you can't see the stool and you can't see the bar, we still decided to like use a C-stand with can you see this little wood here? And just like a chair that kind of looked like the original, because her posture was also part of selling the illusion. Like in the original interview, she's there like this. So if we had this other framing where she's just like, her arms are flopping down, it wouldn't have sold the illusion. I think there was someone talking about this yesterday about sound and trying to find how the other departments could help build that illusion of being in that space. So yeah, that's her. She's looking very happy, and that's the LED volume there.
I think so. I'm waiting for.
And this is what it looks like in the final. So this is a clip from the film, and you'll see that I've used bits from the original interview and the virtual production interview.
Oh, you can't be telling the truth. I'm a little girl. You don't make this shit up. When I met that heavy bag, that became my best friend by far. Hitting somebody was an outlet. I like that part. And lo and behold.
So moving on to Kat Davis, this is actually I thought it was the most effective effective setup in terms of trying to replicate the original. So, so we got lucky with this one because you know how I was telling you we were going through the footage, trying to find like the bits that we could piece together. With Kat Davis, I think she went to the toilet at some point, and we just had the camera running. So the guy at Final Pixel said, well, why don't you just create a dynamic plate that's just a 20-second loop that's just playing, and like every 20 seconds it resets, and you hope that the bit you need is not that bit where it resets. So we got very lucky because, as you can see, like in the original interview, we used a lot of haze above the boxing ring. So you actually see that when you're playing the video, you see how like the haze moves, it sort of engulfs itself. So if we had gone from that to this and the haze had been frozen, it would have looked weird. So we were really lucky in that sense. And we also, I also think that having a darker environment played to our strengths in terms of, you know, it's not as bright as Pat Pineda's background, and so we weren't fighting with the light that the LED wall was showing us. So let me show you what that looks like intercut with the original.
You know, every month we would get together and do something. And one afternoon we were hanging out and she leaned over and kissed me. It changed my whole life. I knew I had been denying something, only half of me living. Being gay was a horrible thing. It was, it's hard to explain the gravity of what happened to you if you came out as being gay. It's so senseless. You love a person and you have to pay for it in such a dire way.
And then moving on to Sue Fox. She's a boxer, but also a historian that would keep everything, including receipts of Coca-Cola cans that she drank in 1976. She was very meticulous. So we put her in this sort of library setting. And I don't know if you noticed, but with all of our Cam A settings, because we did it with Pat Pineda, we just decided let's be uniform and do it with all of our contributors. And it actually helped with Sue Fox as well, because you can see that she's got this table that we couldn't ship from Oregon, so it was really helpful. Eric was talking about this metadata in the camera. We used that as well to try and replicate everything, as it was. But what we found was that even though we were replicating the entire setup, the lights, the camera, everything, it didn't match. And we weren't sure why. We were like, we're doing everything right. What's happening? What's happening? And we started to panic. And we were like, well, let's just go to get some food early because, we don't know what to do. So we're there just eating away at our sandwich, looking into space, panicking. And then the DP realizes that it was a color issue. And he runs back into the studio and he basically realized that the LED wall wasn't emitting the same sort of reflected teal light that the original physical walls had. So all this teal here, like it continued like here, like everything except this section was pretty much like that. And so while things like color temperature and the real world materials diffuse light, all that plays a role in achieving the realism. So that kind of meant that he had this backlight, which you can sort of see falling on like the back of her head, and he had to bring up the teal color to almost mimic what those walls would have done in the real space. And it made me really appreciate, if I were to do this again, I would also measure the color. So yeah, unfortunately ate into our setup time, and it was stressful. But in the end, I think we got there. And you can actually see in Cam B, you can see that there's more teal on that side. Again, I'm really happy with this. And the B cam was a zoom cam, so it's a bit tighter over there. And maybe in the grade, I would have brought down the teal a bit, but I'm happy with it. And this is Lady Tiger, which I was also happy about. And I think on the subject of color, I think the grade played a massive role in helping sell the illusion. So early on, I made a creative decision to go for a more stylized look for this documentary that mimicked the color palette and the texture of the archive that I had, which dated from the 1970s, because I wanted everything to feel like it belonged in the same world. And I had just done a documentary for Netflix where we had shot in anamorphic. It was a story from the 80s. We shot in anamorphic all the interviews, but then everything was like 4:3, so you had all this dead space. And I thought, I'd like to make a film that's kind of in the Academy aspect ratio, because I didn't want that dead space. I wanted to go from these interviews into the archive seamlessly. And in the end, it kind of also helped the LED wall, because by sort of leaning into that grain and texture rather than the sharp definition, it blended the real and virtual world. So yeah, and the fact that the aspect ratio is a bit more square, it meant that we're looking less at the location and more at the subject. So yeah, so to sum up, what did I learn? I mean, I learned so much, but I think having dynamic video plates really sells the illusion in a situation like this, because it just adds those subtle elements that kind of tricks the brain into thinking this is real. And if I could do it again, I might say to a VFX artist, like, can you just add a bit of a flicker of light or a drifting haze or something just to add imperfection to the plate? I found that darker plates work better because, especially if you're in a smaller space, the LED wall is not a light that's getting in the way. When replicating lighting setups, think about your color and what that original space is giving you, and how you're trying to replicate that. And you know, think about, you know, the posture of the person, the hair and makeup, all of these things also play a role in the illusion. And in documentaries, usually at the end of a master interview, we get the room tone. And thinking back on it, you know, I'd probably, I don't know, maybe have speakers having that room tone on repeat, just so that I'm creating, like, I'm recreating those aspects from every angle. So yeah, so Right to Fight was one example of how virtual production solved some problems in this traditional retrospective documentary format. But, you know, how else could VP be used in documentaries? I feel like there's so much more that could be done in this space. And the second half, you know, this bit that's coming next is about some of the ways I've thought of using virtual production, especially the LED wall, for upcoming projects. So last year, I was interviewed for a feature documentary about a Syrian academic investigating mass killings and secret burials of people who had opposed the Syrian government. She had obtained covert footage showing a man from like a death squad leader like executing individuals and disposing of their bodies in a pit on a specific street in Syria like this one. And her mission was to befriend this man online, like the actual killer, and basically by befriending him, getting more information and ultimately get him to admit to the crimes. And during the interview, I was asked, how would I approach the story? And I was going on a bit of a VP wave at the time. I think Reese made a graph. I was probably at that hype stage before crashing down. And what I was thinking about was how this street played a role in the documentary. You know, this street was a street that the academic remembered from her childhood as something entirely different. It was like a vibrant cultural hub where people would have tea and coffee, and now it had been transformed into this crime scene. So the street itself felt like a character that changed over time as she discovered more detail about what had happened there. But because she couldn't go back to Syria, I proposed bringing the location to her and maybe using like Google Earth data, photo and archive to rebuild this street in virtual production. And I believe that this approach wouldn't just visually ground the story, but it would also become a location that this academic could be placed in at different points of the film. You know, she could come back to it based on her own journey as a way of like manifesting her thoughts. So like, you know, walking, camera, she could be there, she could, you know, it'd be a way of seeing what she's thinking, either remembering that cultural hub or, you know, kind of interacting with it. And it made me think about how these virtual environments would help to trigger emotions from our contributors in a way that a traditional documentary interview setup like just simply couldn't access, which is especially exciting for what I'm thinking about doing next documentary-wise. So this is what I'm working on at the moment. It's called Olympic Twins, and it's about these identical twins who swapped places during the LA 1984 Olympics and are caught in a national scandal. And I could have taken this idea to a channel, like I could have tried and get it commissioned, but I decided to go the independent route to have more creative control. And just to recap, you know, that traditional route, the retrospective doc, you've got your master interview, recon scenes and GVs, archive graphics, it's all there. But I wanted to try something different. So for this one, I'm really keen to explore this past tense story through a series of verite scenes where it becomes apparent that the twins still hold unresolved issues from their past in terms of how they respond to one another and so on. And then I would evoke key moments from their past using archive, but also abstractions, which I'll expand in a moment. But just to give you some context as to why the past is so important in this story, the origin of why they ended up in the Olympics came from the fact that their mother had disappeared when they were 3 years old. And as a young girl, Margaret, one of the twins, came to believe that if she became a famous athlete alongside her identical twin sister Madeline on the greatest sports stage in the world, the Olympics, their mum would recognize them and reappear in their lives. So I immediately understood that this was very deep, this was a very heavy moment that directly shaped their lives and was still kind of something that they still carried in the present. So it was very unresolved for both of them, and I wanted to understand, how could I communicate this? And I think we've all been in that situation where, I don't know, we're talking to our mom and she says something and you're no longer in the present, you're suddenly, 7-year-old you doing something, I don't know. So just to explain abstractions, I want to find a visceral way to bring memory into the present, not through the traditional reconstructions that are like literal representations of memory, but by borrowing real-life visuals to create a mood or an echo of memory. So we begin in a grounded, real-world scene, like a conversation, like you and your mom or the twins. And at a certain point, the contributor is emotionally triggered by the memory. And at this moment, we transition the viewer into a different space, into that memory itself. So I've created a previs to illustrate this using some footage that I shot and AI. I'm into AI at the moment. And what you'll see is Madeline standing by a sandpit because she was a long jumper. And as she looks at it, we flow into a scene where you'll see like an espiritista mass, which many of you probably don't know what that means. But in Puerto Rico, it's a kind of spiritual practitioner that communicates with the dead. And actually, their mum used to do this. So it's a way of communicating that she's lost in thought and thinking about her mum. So yeah, let me just play that for you. That was AI. It's amazing the things that it can do. One thing to explain is that one of the twins lives in Belgium, but obviously I want to bring Puerto Rico to her because she can't go there. So I was thinking of using VP from a logistical sense, again, a bit like what I was talking to you about Syria, just bringing the LED volume and bringing plates and images from Puerto Rico for her to respond to. So, she's walking down this corridor and then she's suddenly seeing this. I can imagine the camera being behind her and creating a silhouette of her as she's sort of watching what's unraveling. And then at the same time, like I was saying earlier, I might get an emotional reaction from her seeing this because it will remind her of her mom. So for me, VP is more than just bringing a world that I can't get. It's also about almost trying to evoke a feeling from my contributor. And the final example is that I had was, what if I have my character in a car and she's watching, she's in Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans drifting by, and all of a sudden I want present-day Puerto Rico to become the 1970s Puerto Rico that she remembered, morph into that. And I just thought, well, I know that this kind of setting looks really good in, with an LED wall. So, so I thought it'd be really cool to actually create those like on-screen VFX while she's there watching. So I wasn't able to morph it, but you get a sense of what that could look like. So yeah, I'm super excited about what I can do with this and how I can use it in the future. Thank you.